Hi everyone, it's Miss Barnes, your SEL teacher. Today I am going to read a Black biography to you. This one is about a woman named Zora Neale Hurston, and she is a writer. She was a writer and a storyteller, and it is written by Patricia and Frederick McKissick. Here's our table of contents. Chapter 1 is called Jump at the Sun. And here is a picture of Zora Neale Hurston. She was born January 7th, 1891, and lived until January 28th, 1960. Zora was born in 1891, about 5 miles from Orlando, Florida, in a small town called Eatonville. It was an all-black town founded in 1886. Zora's father, John Hurston, was a preacher. She and her father didn't get along well. He often spanked Zora for being sassy. That's not good. But her mother, Lucy Hurston, made Zora her special child. Lucy told her daughter to, quote, jump at the sun. Zora grew up jumping, running, and playing in the Florida sunshine. Zora was tough. She knew how to fight, so the boys let her play with them. But the young girl also loved learning about things. She would slip under the porch to read. Her mother made sure Zora had plenty to read. And here's a picture. It says, jump at the sun. As a child, Zora loved outdoor games. As a grown-up, above left, she still liked to play. There she is. Zora always liked going to Joe Clark's store in Eatonville. Men and women sat on the porch and told stories. Zora enjoyed the stories her neighbors told about tricky rabbits and strong black men. They called these stories big ol' lies. When Zora was 13 years old, her mother died. Her father married again right away. Zora didn't like her stepmother, and she still did not get along with her father. Soon Zora was old enough to understand her mother's words. It was time to jump at the sun. She couldn't really jump high enough to touch the sun, but if she tried, at least she would be up off the ground. As soon as she could, Zora left home. This caption says, Zora listened when the adults gathered to talk on the porch of a general store, like this. Chapter 2, On the Road. Zora joined a traveling show company. She took care of the costumes. She spent long hours mending and sewing, packing and unpacking. It was hard work, but at least she was away from the father and stepmother she didn't like. Zora felt lucky that she was getting to see some of the world. Still, she never gave up the idea of going back to school. In 1917, Zora left the show company. She went to a high school in Baltimore, Maryland. This caption says, Zora did not get along with her stepmother, so she left home. She was very brave to leave home and go out on her own. She had one dress, one pair of shoes, and no money. She graduated from high school in June 1918. Then she went to college in Washington, D.C. for 2 years. During that time, Zora began writing. She was asked to join a writers group at the college. Zora wrote her first short story, John Redding Goes to Sea. It was printed in the writers group magazine, The Stylus, in May 1921. Zora knew then that she could be a writer. I wonder how many of you think about being a writer someday. Zora helped with costumes for a traveling show. That's that picture there. And this one says Zora Center, so there she is in the middle, with classmates at Howard University in Washington, D.C. Zora began writing in college. Chapter 3, Making It in New York. In the 1920s, many African Americans were leaving the South and moving to northern cities. Many of them moved to New York City. Zora went there in 1925. She settled in Harlem, a mostly black neighborhood in New York City. In the 1920s, many African American writers, artists, and musicians lived and worked there. Their work was fresh and different. This famous period of time was called the Harlem Renaissance. I'm going to go back to the other page so we can look closely at this picture. It says, Zora's writing was different. She wrote about Southern blacks and used the language she heard them speak. Zora Neale Hurston was one of those fresh young writers. A lot of white people were interested in Harlem. Many of them wanted to help the young writers too. They met the writers and poets at parties and helped them get their work into magazines and books. These people were called patrons. So here's Zora with writers Langston Hughes in the middle. That's him. You might have heard of Langston Hughes. And Jessie Fawcett on the left. So there's Zora right here. The statue honors Booker T. Washington, another famous black man. And this says, Harlem was an exciting place to live. People found many ways to have fun. One person who helped Zora was Mrs. Charlotte Osgood Mason. She was a very, very rich woman who was a patron to Zora and several other writers and artists. Zora entered a writing contest. 2 of her short stories won, so she was invited to the awards dinner. Fannie Hurst, a white writer, was a judge in the contest. She liked Zora's work very much. They met at the awards dinner. Hurst learned that Zora needed a job so she could go back to college. She hired Zora to be her secretary. At last, Zora had enough money to go back to school. Up until that time, she had worked 2 or 3 jobs to make ends meet. So there's a picture of Charlotte Mason. It says Charlotte Mason liked Zora's work and wanted her to write more. Hurst also helped Zora get into Barnard College, a women's college at Columbia University in New York City. Zora was the only black woman at Barnard at the time. During that time, Zora still wrote stories, and her writing was getting stronger and better. She graduated from Barnard in 1928. At Barnard College in New York City, Zora began to study African American folklore. Chapter 4, The Voice of Her People. Zora was very interested in studying the ways different people lived. She listened to their stories and folklore. With the help of her patrons, Zora traveled all over the South, gathering African American stories. Her research was like sitting on Joe Clark's store porch, listening to people tell stories all the time. She loved it. Zora was one of the first African Americans to write these stories down. And there's a picture of her before we go on. Zora learned about different kinds of worship. Here she beats a drum used in some ceremonies. That's cool. So these were the stories of her people, and she recorded them in the language of her people. She would write about a storm like this. God was grumbling his thunder and playing the zigzag lightning through his fingers. Her book, Mules and Men, was a collection of her stories. It was written in 1935. Zora was well known for her short stories. In the 1930s, she also wrote 3 novels. The most famous of them was Their Eyes Were Watching God, written in 1937. She also wrote her life story, Dust Tracks on a Railroad, in 1942. So there's a picture of Zora right here. And it says, Zora traveled through the South to hear people's stories and songs. Here's a picture of her. It says, Zora also wrote scripts for a radio station in Ohio and helped write some plays. Chapter 5, A Very Special Writer. People enjoyed being around Zora. She charmed them with stories about her life in Eatonville. Sometimes her stories were true. Sometimes they weren't. Very few people ever knew the difference. Zora was married twice, but not for long. She didn't talk about that much. Her first love was writing, and her second was her freedom. Zora continued to study and write about folklore during the 1930s and 1940s. She traveled through the South and to Central America, South America, Haiti, and Jamaica. There, she gathered the stories people told. In 1948, Zora was falsely accused of hurting a child. She was arrested, but it was all a mistake. She had been in Central America at the time of the crime. The charges were dropped, but she was very upset. By now, all the parties were over. All the friends had gone. Zora chose to live alone in the South, away from friends and family. But she didn't feel sorry for herself. It says Zora researched Black culture for the Federal Writers Project. Zora didn't write much in her last years, except for a few articles and short stories. Her books didn't make a lot of money. When she ran out of money, she would take a job as a maid. And there's Zora in the center here. Zora believed every person had a story to tell, and she was always ready to listen. Zora, in the front, went to Jamaica, Haiti, and South America to learn about the local folklore. She moved back to New York in 1957 to work on a book. The book was never finished. Zora moved back to Florida and died a poor woman on January 28, 1960. She was buried in an unmarked grave. Zora Neale Hurston might have been forgotten if it hadn't been for Alice Walker, another Black writer. She worked hard to have Zora's old stories turned into books again. Walker had a headstone placed on Zora's grave in 1973. Zora wrote the stories people told her. They were a lot like the stories she heard when she was growing up. If she hadn't gathered them, those stories might have been lost forever. Thanks to writer Alice Walker above, Zora's books became popular once again. Zora's stories are special because she knew how to write in the language of real people. And that's the end of the biography. Here's a timeline right here, which shows the important dates of when she was born, some important milestones throughout her life, and the year that she died. Words to know, of course, is always good. Folklore, graduate, Harlem Renaissance. Novel, we know what a novel is, right? It's a fictional story, so it's not true. So Zora wrote some novels. And patron, Their Eyes Were Watching God is Zora's novel about a young Black woman. Some other words to know: research, secretary, short story, traveling show company. Zora researched the stories of African Americans. And here are some resources if you wanted to learn more about Zora Neale Hurston, some different books and websites with more information about her. And then, of course, at the end of a nonfiction book, we have what's called the index, which is where we can try and look up different things that we want to know more about Zora. So there we go. I hope you enjoyed this biography of this very inspirational Black person from history. And I look forward to reading more books to you in the future. Have a wonderful day, Gators.